Great to have you with us. Welcome to Making Sense. I'm Gareth Edwards. Very important story over the past few days, especially for parents and caregivers and those in the education sector as far as grade ones are concerned. New research having come out from Stellenbosch University is looking at the impact of the difference in age in grade one learners and the impact it's having not just on their academic development, but potentially in some of those grade one learners having to even repeat the year, be held back. Now, this has all sorts of knock-on effects, but we also need to understand why it's taking place at the moment. Bianca Bohmer joining us, who is the author, of course, of the research. Bianca, great to have you on Making Sense as well. Just for everyone watching, your title, because I know it's important for everyone to understand where you're coming from with this.
Right, so thank you very much for having me, Gareth. I am with a unit down at Stellenbosch University called Research on Socioeconomic Policy, and I'm one of the researchers at that unit.
And now the research you did, if my intro was correct, and please correct it if I wasn't right, the issue here seems to be not getting into grade one as a grade one learner. It's the difference in age in grade one. Why is that important? What did the data actually show us?
Right. So what we took a look at here is across a number of provinces, and really was quite a large sample, about 500,000 kids that we tracked from grade 1 to grade 4. And we took a look at the age at which the kids are coming into grade 1. And if you look at the South African policy, this allows kids to be coming in from, in January, about 5.5 to 7 years of age. And
it's 18 months.
It's 18 months.
It's a big gap.
It is indeed. And we can talk about how that's implemented in a second. But when you're 5 or 5.5, an entire year, because you're taking in kids once a year, so they're going to be about a year apart, at least in age. And those 12 months really matter when you're still that young. So this matters less, obviously, as you get older. It doesn't matter as much when you're 20, if you're 21 or 20. But if you're 5 or if you're 6, that's a really big difference still. This is in terms of cognitive development, physical development, social development. So kind of every month really matters at that age.
So the way I read the research, and again, this is why I'm so glad we've got someone as smart as you to explain this to a muggle like me. So if my birthday, I'm going to compare you and I.
Great.
My birthday is in January.
Yes.
It's not, but let's say it's in January.
Perfect. I'm
going into grade 1. Your birthday, also grade 1, is in December. I'm going into early, aren't I?
Right. So if, and again, if you have kids starting between 6 and 7, you would be the oldest in that cohort, or amongst the oldest, and I would be amongst the youngest. And this is exactly what we took a look at. So specifically around what this means for marks and for repetition rates. Can I switch it back to 5.5 and 6.5? Yeah. Because actually in the sample that we looked at, that was the far more common age range that kids came in. About 90% of kids outside of the Western Cape and Northern Cape start between 5.5 and 6.5. So that year of difference in terms of repetition rates, and we do have quite high repetition rates in grade 1, actually in grade 1, 2, and 3, but then also kind of throughout. For that 13% repetition rate, if you started at 5.5, about 20% of the kids. So at 5.5, about 20% of kids are repeating, whilst if you're a year older, so that would be you, in this example, about 8% of kids are repeating. So it's quite a big difference. And this is simply because over that year period, you kind of haven't had enough time to catch up yet.
What do we mean by catch-up? Is that EQ? Is it attention span? Is it discipline? What happens in that year where one of the learners, a few of the learners are being left behind? What aren't they getting?
It's actually less what they're getting at school, and it's more kind of what you're coming in with. It's literally just that age difference. So it's simply the fact that you are a lot older or are a lot younger, what you're coming into school with in terms of all of the things that you've mentioned. So this is literally, it's knowledge, it's vocabulary, it's numeracy, it is all of your fine and gross motor skills, it's all of the social and emotional skills. It's really the entire package that's kind of developing One, by what you're learning at school, but also simply the fact that you're aging means that you're learning as you go along. And this sort of aging as you're learning as you go along, there's just a gap as you start out. And again, because you're still quite young at kind of 6, it's
a big difference. I mean, I know very little about ECD and early childhood development, of course, but it sounds like a very big gap. So where did this perception come from? Because I don't have kids. Friends of mine do have kids, and there's always, not always, but for a long time now, the earlier you can get them into class, the earlier you can get them into school, I believed back in the day was better, but seemingly your research is showing not always.
Right. And there's good reasons also to believe that, right? If you are entering school earlier, it means you might get through the system earlier. What that means is you could enter the workforce earlier, so you have a longer time to work, for example. So there really is a lot of this sort of perception of like the earlier you get in, the earlier you start learning, kind of you can be ahead of your peers, is that perception. And for certain kids, this works. But especially for kids that are less ready, and we have quite a big gender differential, kind of globally, but very specifically in South Africa as well, where we see that boys tend to be slightly less ready than girls to start. And also we know that kids that are in less well-resourced, more rural areas are also less ready. So what that means is that for those children, and I mean this might be any child, if they are likely to face more challenges, what it does mean is it just that they're at much higher risk of repeating, especially if they are also younger.
I saw the research talks about, and I want to make sure I get the terminology right. Please correct me, Bianca, if I get it wrong. The poorer schools, arguably the rural schools, struggle with this more. Why is that?
So there's 2 elements to this. So the first is this gap that we talked about. So this 20 versus 8%, that gap is bigger in poorer schools. So they're even further apart if you look at the youngest versus the oldest. So basically the youngest kids are again getting much lower marks relative to a wealthier school, but also then are at a higher risk of repeating, even higher than they would otherwise be. So that's one side to it. The other element is more systemic, which is that because we have this 18-month window that we mentioned at the beginning, we see that this is differently implemented in different schools. So certainly I and a lot of people that I've spoken to think that kids go to school between 6 and 7. And this is sort of standard policy in the Western Cape and the Northern Cape. But in the other provinces, the vast majority of kids start school between 5.5 and 6.5. But in independent schools and quintile 5 schools, so we have a quintile system in South Africa where quintile 1 to 3 schools are no-fee schools. 4s and 5s are allowed to pay fees. So your quintile 5 are your wealthiest schools. There, about 60% of schools start kids between 6 and 7. So what we also have going on is almost like 2 parallel systems of when kids start school, where poorer kids generally start 6 months earlier on average than wealthier kids.
What's the impact of starting earlier? I'm trying to understand. So grade 1, let's work on the numbers that you've given your research, where you could see some of those learners being held back because they've gone into school in what's supposed to be their grade 1 year, but too early in their year. What does that impact in grade 2, grade 3, grade 4? How far, what's the lag on this, and when do we start seeing that impact?
Right. So there's 2 bits to this. So like we do see that throughout grade 1, 2, and 3, you are more likely to repeat if you are younger. So overall, repetition in the foundation phase, so those 3 grades, is actually very high in South Africa, or very high is relative, but it's reasonably high by global sort of middle income standards, where about a quarter of kids are repeating in once in grades 1, 2, or 3. So this is then much higher, obviously, if you are younger. In terms of marks, then the first time that you're allowed to repeat again, because you're only allowed to repeat once in a phase, is then in grade 4. And we see, again, slightly higher rates of repetition if you are younger, but we still mainly see this in the marks. So in grade 1, the mark difference, if we look at your maths and home language marks, there's about a mark difference between being 1 year older or 1 year younger, but 11 marks for first additional languages. This declines by the time we get to grade 4. It's about 5 to 6 marks across all 3 subjects. So we do see some fade out in some sense, so it gets less. But there's a couple of things that are driving this. So one is just that you are now older. Yeah. So again, that 1 year gap now matters a bit less. But also because so many more of the younger kids have repeated, they're now all a year older. So we have, by definition, sort of made the younger kids a year older. So there's some maturation that's also playing into this fade out. That's sort of just because of how the system is set up and the fact that we're not providing support in another way.
I want to talk about, I saw in the research as well, my very cursory reading of it, the school nutrition and the school nutrition program, which we can get into in a moment. And forgive me, I just want to ask this question because in my research for our little discussion, when I call it research, talking to a few people, I've spoken to a few parents who actually made the decision to hold their own children back by a year because their birthdays are in December or whenever it might be. What do you tell someone watching this now who might be in this scenario come next year? What is the advice? Not from an education perspective, just from what the research shows. How does a parent decide whether to keep a grade 1 learner age back a year instead of putting them through the system and have them repeat it? I'm just wondering if you have a view on that.
Yeah, this is very tricky to answer in general with parents because it's so unbelievably child specific. So I think my broad advice would be to speak to the teachers of the child, any other kind of adult or psychologist or whoever, the developmental professional that's involved at the school, and really think about what is best for your child.
Parents know best.
Exactly. Or in general can make a decision because they know their child. So there is, especially if you are at the threshold, that is the time when kids are most likely to be put into another year. So the threshold is June, July for the 5.5 or December, January, the one that you've just mentioned, kind of to keep a child back. If a child is struggling in grade R, and they are the very youngest, there's kind of 2 things. One, very definitely it's worth having that discussion around whether to hold kids back, even more so if they are at the 5.5 possible entry, and you have the option of then holding them back a year. If they are likely to struggle, you then have the trade-off of, do you want to risk your child being in grade 1 for 2 years in a row? And that might be a valid option. Or is it then, are you worried about the harmful effects potentially of kind of from a confidence perspective of the child repeating? But certainly if your child has already gone through this process and you perhaps have a child that is repeating, also just taking into account the fact that age might have contributed to this is worth knowing as a parent. It's not that your child is kind of academically
stunted.
Not at all. So like age really does matter. And especially for the boys, I think they just take a little bit longer to kind of get started.
I just thought that was important for the parents watching now or the loved ones to get an idea of what you thought of that. On the school nutrition issue as well, that brought up as well in the research, where does school nutrition play a role in this? Why did that even come up?
So this is one of the reasons. So those 2 different implementation systems across kind of the 5.5 to 6.5 and the 6 to 7, there's often questions there around why is it that these 2 developed? Why is it that some children generally start at a younger age versus others? And it is very likely because it is so socioeconomically divided that childcare, school nutrition, other factors that might lead parents to send kids to school, also the perceptions that you mentioned that it's better for kids, have sort of resulted in these 2 parallel systems. But what this essentially means is that for the kids that are already less ready, so in schools that are poorer, in schools that are less well-resourced, there's now this added disadvantage of now also starting earlier. So essentially being, less mature as well on top of this, which means that you then have kind of this added inequality that's being brought into the system.
A lot of this sounds like there's I don't want to use the word inequality too easily here, but I want to talk about framework very quickly before we start landing this plane. The policy framework for this, what are you hoping to do with this research? You've done incredible work, of course, but what are you hoping this does? Does the education department change something? Do they need to review something? What's the hope here?
So at the moment, we already have a relatively flexible system. So we have these 18 months during which kids are able to enter school. And I think the reason that we did this research at this point in time is that, one, the Bella Bill in 2024 made grade R compulsory. So we now will have more children that are, hopefully all children that are in the reception year, and therefore hopefully more ready for grade 1. But also there's been a lot of work that's been happening on the ECD side to try and improve access as well as quality through the Banapela drive along with other things. And the idea is if kids are able to at least access childcare and some form of nutrition earlier, perhaps some of these constraints would be loosened. That were perhaps leading parents to send kids kind of at the 5.5 to 6.5 age. So then it becomes a question of more what is best for the child as opposed to what needs to happen in order to access essentially childcare or nutrition.
Okay, and as we say goodbye for now, I like to do this at the end of every episode. Final thought, anything I haven't asked you that you would like people to know that are watching this, maybe direct them to the research that you've done and what you'd like for parents and caregivers to do with this information?
Right. So I think the information is available on the RECEP website. So there's both a working paper and a policy brief. So by all means, please, go have a look. And I think the big things on the parent side that we want them to know is, one, that they have a sense of what the law is, because what is shown in various places tends to be either the compulsory or the minimum age policy. So parents tend to think they have less flexibility than they actually do have, even within the confines of the law. So I think just knowing that that exists and knowing that this can be exercised if it makes sense for your child.
Wonderful to have you on the show. All the very best. We're going to talk again. I'd love to get your thoughts on this as well. Leave your comments below. I'd like to get Bianca back in a couple of months' time as well. I'd love to hear from the parents on this, the caregivers, the teachers, education sector. Leave your comments below. And that is where we're going to say goodbye to Bianca Bohmer for the moment. Thank you very much. Your views on the grade 1, this research that has come out. Have you got a child going into grade 1? Are they in grade 1 at the moment? Have they gone through grade 1? Would you have changed anything at all? You let us know. Bianca, what a pleasure having you. And thank you very much for joining us on this week's edition of Making Sense. We'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.